Okay, apologetic students. Hey, this is your teacher, and I wanted to try and record a couple of lectures before I lost my voice here and the coughing started. So I apologize for my voice, but I did manage to get COVID after all, so here I am. Hopefully, you should have just taken the reading quiz on the chapter on the problem of evil. I hope it wasn't too disturbing for you. I wanted to just kind of continue the conversation we were having, and I'm really disappointed that I caught that of all the weeks to be out, I'm out this week. I really feel like this is a topic which is better used in a discussion format, and in fact, this lecture is kind of set up to be more of a discussion rather than a lecture. But it is what it is. So the question, obviously, just wanted to have this slide up as a reminder of what the problem of evil is, and specifically why it's a problem for theists. And one thing that we did not get into last week, which I at least wanted to mention, is the idea that there are multiple problems of evil. And the biggest division, I think, within the problem of evil is the division between the philosophical problem and then the practical, or what's sometimes called the existential problem, which is there's two different ways to look at this. In one sense, if you are looking at the whole question of the existence of evil and whether or not that's consistent with the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God, that's kind of looking at it philosophically, kind of from above. But then there's the other situation when you are actually confronting evil in your own life, whether it's evil caused by another person or maybe even by yourself or just due to suffering through some tragedy. And those are two very different situations. The person who's calling out in the midst of a personal tragedy needs one thing, and a person who's not in the midst of a personal tragedy but is simply asking questions about the nature of God and the nature of evil needs something completely different. And the arguments that we have been talking about and that we'll be going through today are really designed for that person who's not in the midst of the crisis themselves, but is just asking the question. And the person in the midst of the crisis doesn't need these arguments. They need a hug. They need you to be with them, to support them, to bring them dinner, to do whatever is needed in the moment. And it may be that a person who's in the midst of personal suffering may ask these kinds of questions. But even then, sometimes they're not really looking for a philosophical answer, and they almost, when they say, how could God allow this? How could I believe in God in light of this? They're almost asking it probably more rhetorically and maybe not looking for a philosophical answer. So those are two very separate situations. So we, in trying to answer the philosophical problem of how these can be consistent, we talked last time about the idea of free will, and I think that's one that in both apologetics classes everybody jumped to right away, that the answer is human freedom, and that has been a pretty prominent answer throughout Christian history. And we had talked last time about that the writings of Alvin Plantinga on this topic, that he's a Christian who's a philosopher who took this defense and made it philosophically and analytically precise, and really shows how free will provides an answer to this. The idea that God can't create a world of free creatures and then determine that they'll only do what's good, because in that case they're not free. That to create creatures of good, he has to also create creatures capable of evil. And we also talked about the fact that Plantinga is Arminian, that the argument and the way he's framed it up is really one that's not available to someone who's coming at the problem from a from the perspective of Reformed theology or Calvinism, the idea that morally significant decisions that we make in life are somehow determined by God, and we're not actually free to make them. Although Calvinists do believe that we're morally responsible for our choices. And to them, that's why Calvinism is sometimes called compatibilism, because it's the belief that our moral guilt, our moral responsibility is compatible with the idea that the choices are actually predetermined, and that those two ideas are somehow compatible. Arminianism is the belief that those ideas are not compatible, and that we truly have free will. And so, as I mentioned last week, Calvinists can make a version of the free will defense, but it's a little more difficult to make, obviously, from that theological perspective. And I wanted to move on and talk about another response to the problem of evil that has often been raised, and that's the idea that without evil, there are certain good character traits that we would never be able to develop, or certain good aspects to our existence that would never be allowed to flourish. And this idea is sometimes called soul building, and that phrase was coined by a philosopher named John Hick, who, ironically enough, towards the end of his life, actually kind of left Orthodox Christianity. But at the time he wrote on the topic of evil, he was still kind of in the fold. And he pointed out, although others had pointed it out before him, that evil and suffering provide opportunities in our lives to develop things like courage and fortitude and strength that we wouldn't otherwise have. And so, kind of related to, but really separate from the idea of free will, this is something where you could look at creation and say it's better for people to be able to develop these traits, but in order to do so, you have to allow for a world in which there can be pain and suffering. And so the quote from John Hick on the slide kind of sums this up. Human goodness, slowly built up through personal histories of moral effort, has a value in the eyes of the Creator, which justifies even the long travail of the soul-making process. And so that's an assumption, obviously. You could argue there's an act of faith there that God believed it was worth it, and we have to accept that. But that certainly provides a basis for understanding why some of the things that happen in the world do happen, and why a good, powerful Creator could be justified in allowing it. And this is one where the free will defense is so obviously biblical, I didn't think I needed to turn to that. But I think this one also has biblical support. And I just chose a couple of passages. I could have chosen many, many others. But in Romans 5, towards the beginning of that chapter, Paul talks about suffering specifically, and he says, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. And then that leads into a conversation about salvation. And so I think part of Paul's point in this passage is that this provides, that suffering provides an opportunity for us to develop traits that ultimately bring us closer to God and give us hope. And James is kind of making the same point in his letter. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. So again, I could have pulled other passages out as well. I think parts of Job, and you could even argue some places in the gospel that get into this same idea that when we endure these things, they can have good consequences. You would never say that, again, especially to someone in the midst of suffering, you would never say, well, hey, it's okay that you're going through this horrible ordeal because look at how great it's going to make your character. Obviously, that's a grotesque thing. And it's probably even grotesque to say that to the person years and years after they've gone through a personal tragedy. But at the same time, you can't deny the truth of the idea. And again, it is biblical. I think it's just, again, in this one especially, I think you need to be careful talking to people who have actually been through real personal tragedies, because it sounds callous and utilitarian, but it does seem to have some warrant. Another kind of a related reason on why God might be justified in allowing evil is that it draws people to him. And this is, I think, related to the soul making idea that C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, says that pain is God's megaphone. He uses it to call out to us. And again, this also has biblical support. The Psalms are just filled with references to the psalmist calling out to God in their pain and their sense of injustice, or when they're in danger. And the passages I've put on the slide actually are examples of God promising that he will comfort people in the midst of pain. None of these say he'll take the pain away, and obviously just experience tells you that, but that you will get comfort if you call on God in these moments. And that part of what it means to be, if part of what it means to be a human is to suffer, part of what it means to be a Christian human is to suffer and to cry out to God, and for God to meet us in that moment. And I'll just say, I'm not going to go into a lot of personal stories in a recorded lecture, because that just seems weird. But the times in my life when I've encountered tragedy, I can honestly say that I've never felt God closer than in those moments. But I also acknowledge that I've talked to people who've reported the opposite, who said it felt like God was distant in those moments. And I can't speak to that. I just know that for myself and for a lot of Christians with whom I'm close, they've said the opposite, that God seems to be especially close in those times. And also, I mean, the unique thing about Christianity is that we're the only religion in which God actually becomes one of us and suffers with us. And so in that sense, we are unique, that our God truly knows what it is to suffer. All right, I want to move on, and I want to talk about how atheists have responded to this, because one response to all these different arguments about free will and soul building and all these justifications that God might have is for atheists to try to come up with scenarios that are so awful that they couldn't possibly have a justification. There was an article a while back in a journal called Philosophia Christi, where they did a whole issue on the Old Testament warfare passages and the difficulties those pose. And it obviously got into the problem of evil. And one of the articles raised the argument that there can be no justification for commanding the killing of innocent children, for example. So that may be one example that's used as an evil that couldn't possibly have a justification, would be all of the very, very young children who suffered at Auschwitz, and the other places where Dr. Mengele and his cohorts did their horrific experiments, that there's no way that could be justified, that just should have been stopped. And you could, it's hard. Obviously, you can say, well, free will. The Nazis had free will and they exercised it horribly. But one scenario that a philosopher named William Rowe came up with was the idea of a fawn who's burned to death in a forest fire. They're trapped in a forest fire. They burn to death. They suffer, and no human ever witnesses it. The remains are burned up, so no human can even come onto the scene and see that it's happened and have that impact them. And the argument that William Rowe made was that there are evils like this one that would just be pointless, that there'd be no point to them. And a closely related idea is the concept of horrendous evil, which is a kind of the child at Auschwitz, the idea of things that happen that are so horrific, even if you could maybe come up with a theoretical justification, there's just morally you can't justify them. They're just so horrible, they ought not to ever happen. And that was the argument being made in the article I mentioned earlier, was the idea that there can be no justification for example, ordering the murder of innocent children. And so that's the idea kind of behind horrendous evil. And I'd mentioned the novel The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. This is really the position of one of the main characters in that book, who's an atheist, who just takes the position that there is no possible, there are some things that are so evil, and he goes through some examples that are horrible and says there's just no way that those can be justified. And he says, I'm not saying that I'm positive God doesn't exist. I'm just saying I don't want any part of a world like that or a God like that that would allow that. That even if it's worth it in some cosmic sense, I don't want any part of it. And so that idea philosophically is sometimes been presented as this idea of horrendous or pointless or gratuitous evil. That and again, the two top bullet points are kind of related. They're evils that you like the burning fawn, where you can't imagine any scenario where they could bring about a greater good, or they're evils like the children at Auschwitz, where it's just so horrific that you can't imagine how they could ever be worth it. That even if you could maybe theoretically justify them, they're just so horrible that a good God would never ever allow them. And there have been many responses to this. And you can't really talk about this version of the problem without getting into the book of Job. I think the Christian response is is really rooted in some sense in the book of Job. And hopefully you all know the story of Job, but I'll just summarize it really quickly. Job was upright, good man in God's eyes, but the devil comes to God and says, well, he's only good because you've given him all these blessings. You've made him rich and he has this great family. If you took all of his blessings, or if you let me take all of his blessings away, he'll curse you and he won't be so great anymore. And so God allows that. In the book, the first 30 some chapters are Job and three of his friends trying to make sense of this. And they all get it wrong, but Job's friends get it much more wrong than he does. But when God finally answers and tells Job, answers Job's complaints, Job's calling out in the whole book, just asking why he's being made to suffer. He just wants to know why. And the answer God gives him is not what you'd expect. He doesn't tell him why. He just reveals himself to Job in a more complete way. And God talks about who he is. And so he refers back to creation, that he established everything. And so he basically reveals more of himself to Job. And after that revelation, Job's response is one of repentance and acceptance. He says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. That even though he was never told in the whole book why he was made to suffer, by seeing more of God, he was able to accept it. And that really gets to I think the response to this idea that there are some evils that look to us to be pointless or gratuitous or unnecessary. What the atheist is saying in these arguments is, I don't see any point in this evil, so therefore there is no point. And an alternative possibility is, I don't see a point, so I'll suspend judgment on whether it has a point or not. And the question is, if you're dealing with the existence of a deity, such as the God that is presented in the Bible, which one of these is the more reasonable position to take? Obviously, Job takes the second position. He's given enough of a revelation of God that he says, I'm absolutely certain that you're just and you're good, and I don't need to worry about right now whether I can see the point of my suffering or not. And this may sound a little bit like blind faith. I don't think it is. I think if I have good reasons to believe that God exists and is good, which I do, we spent a good chunk of the semester talking about them, and we're going to continue after this unit when we talk about the Bible. I don't see why I don't think it's blind faith to say there may be things that God does that I don't understand. And so, and I think, again, there's biblical support. You look And I could have quoted a lot of other verses. I picked from Isaiah 55, and this is one you've probably heard a lot. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways, my ways. And then in Psalm 50, the psalmist, God says to the psalmist, "You thought I was altogether like you, but I will rebuke you." So it's this idea that if God is who the Bible says he is, then we shouldn't expect to be able to see the reasons behind why he does what he does. And one of my professors in graduate school, Dr. Yandel, wrote extensively on this, and it was his writings on that are some of my favorite in this area. And the quote I have there is really kind of indicative of how he approaches this kind of evil. He says, "It's not inconsistent to hold that there is evidence that God exists, but that tracking God's reasons for allowing what God allows is often beyond us." And he uses an example, and if this example helps you, then that's great. If it doesn't, then just forget it. But he uses example, if you could imagine being in a room, say you're in class right now, and a man runs into the room with a paper bag completely covering his head, like in the picture, and someone asks you, do you think he has a mustache or not? And he doesn't talk to you. You don't hear anything. You don't know anything about him. You have no idea who it is. They just ask you to guess, do you think he has a mustache? And obviously you shrug your shoulders and say, I have no idea. I can't see his face. But what if someone were to say to you, well, you don't see one, do you? I mean, you can't see that he has a mustache, so he must not have one because you can't see it. Is that a good argument? Is that a good argument for predicting that he doesn't have a mustache because you're not able to see it? And the answer is obviously no, that you're not in a position to see it because there's a bag over his head. So the fact that you can't see a mustache doesn't even count as evidence that he doesn't have one because you're not in a position to see it. And the argument here, the atheist is basically in the problem of evil, is doing the same thing that the person is doing in my example, the person who says you should guess that he doesn't have one since you can't see it. The atheist is saying, I can't see a reason why God would allow this evil, therefore there is no reason. And the fact is, we aren't in a position to know God's motives. And so the fact that we can't see a reason for a particular evil shouldn't count as evidence that there is no point to allowing that evil. Just like you not seeing the man's mustache shouldn't count as evidence that he doesn't have one. And that approach, that taking that humble approach to the problem of evil, I think is appropriate, again, in light of what the Bible says about God and about us. And I'm happy to talk more when I come back. I really don't believe that's blind faith. I think that's taking more of a wait and see attitude and being humble about what we think we should and shouldn't be able to know. And I'm going to end it there for today. There may be people who are unsatisfied with us stopping here or unhappy about us stopping here. I just wanted to say we will, whether it's in tomorrow's lecture or when I'm back next week, I will go into a little bit more depth about why I think this is a reasonable position. And then we'll be moving on from the problem of evil to the problem of hell, which I think is the worst version of the problem of evil. I just wanted to mention, if you have questions or thoughts, leave them for me on Google Classroom, on the stream, on the front page of Google Classroom, and I will respond. And if they're decent questions or thoughts, I'll award double stars for people participating in class via Google Classroom. So, and if you're comfortable, leave your comment on stream so that everybody can see it, and then I'll respond, and we can kind of have a class discussion that way. Thank you.